notice earlier when I was talking about the Quran and science, I mentioned that the kind of arguments that Muslims use will only work in an atmosphere of ignorance. If you don't know anything about what the Quran actually says on a lot of stuff, and someone presents you with this paper saying that it's filled with all these miraculous scientific insights, that sounds very persuasive, but it only works if you haven't really read what the Quran says. And likewise, this, which is, I would consider this the most stupendous myth on the planet right now, the myth of the perfectly preserved Quran. Because you can spend 5 minutes of research and find out that the Quran has not been perfectly preserved. And yet, almost every Muslim you'll ever run into in your entire life is completely convinced that the Quran has been perfectly preserved right down to the letter. So that's kind of disheartening when you have more than 1 billion people who all believe something that's complete nonsense and that you could show them as complete nonsense like that. But there's a positive side to it. And the positive side is that Muslim apologists have built up the faith of Muslims around the world on such a shaky, unstable foundation of lies that are so incredibly easy to refute that they have left the door wide open for a team of well-trained Christians to come in there and wreak absolute havoc. And so part of the goal of that, of responding to the claims, is that if you're talking to a Muslim, that Muslim's confidence in Islam probably hasn't been based on any sort of actual research. He's just heard from his imam all his life that the Quran's been perfectly preserved, that the Quran contains all these miraculous scientific insights, that Muhammad's the greatest man who ever lived. He's heard these things all his life. And so he assumes they're true because he's not hearing otherwise, right? He's not hearing otherwise from the education system or politicians or the media or Hollywood. They're all affirming what he's been hearing all his life from his imam. And his imam didn't learn these claims from sitting down and studying and coming to informed conclusions. His imam heard these things all his life when he was growing up. And so this is how these kinds of things spread. People just pass them on because no one ever steps in and investigates them. And so you have an entire Muslim community who that's convinced of certain claims that are completely and demonstrably false. Something can be false when you can't prove that it's false. But some things are false and you can prove like that they're false. Islam is based on those kinds of claims, things that you, look, this isn't a difference of opinion here. We're not looking at the same evidence and kind of coming to different conclusions about it. The claim that the Quran has been perfectly preserved is complete, total nonsense, wherever you look. And so the idea that this could be a core claim of Islam, and one of the first things any Muslim will tell you as evidence that Islam is true, is amazing. But what will happen if a well-trained group of Christians learns what the Muslim sources say about the history of the Quran, learns some of the differences in the manuscripts, learns to respond to the claims of people like Jamal Badawi? If Christians learn to do that, then what happens is you're in a conversation with a Muslim. The Muslim says, the Quran's been perfectly preserved right down to the letter. That's obviously a miracle. And you say, what about this? What about this? What about this hadith saying that there were changes in the Quran? What about these two manuscripts? Look, I can't even read Arabic, but look, those are different words right there. Those are different. How do you explain that? And guess what? That Muslim's never heard that before. He's never seen that before. This is new information to him. And it's, at first, he'll give you some response that he goes and finds on Google or from his imam, and he'll give you that response. And then you present more, and he'll give you another silly response, and then you present more. And those things are slowly building up in his mind. And what eventually happens is, wait a minute, the only reason I've believed in these things all my life is that that's what I heard from my Muslim leaders. But the actual evidence, which is being given to me by a Christian, which my leaders kept from me all my life, they didn't bring this up. They didn't bring these things up to me and tell me and explain them for me. They pretended that these things do not exist. Guess what? If all of your reasons for believing in Islam are based on people that you respect, and you start not trusting those people anymore because you realize they're telling you things that aren't true, at some point you realize, wow, maybe I need to look into this for myself. And when that happens, they are on their way out of Islam, because that path does not end in Islam. All right, so we're going to look at what some of the Muslim sources say. Now, the claim, Dr. Badawi brought this up. Chapter 15, verse 9, we have, without doubt, sent down the message, and we will assuredly guard it from corruption. And there are Muslims who will say, there are Muslims who, when I quote what their sources say about changes to their text, they will say all of those sources must have been corrupted. Why? Because Allah promises that the Quran is going to be perfectly preserved. Right? Now notice the problem there, right? If Allah says He's going to perfectly preserve the Quran, and then you find out from history the Quran hasn't been perfectly preserved, the response should be, well, I'm either misinterpreting this verse or the verse is just wrong. Allah wasn't able to preserve it. But you shouldn't say, okay, here's what all the actual evidence says. Let me throw out all of the evidence because Allah said this in the Quran. Right? How would you verify what Allah is saying here without actually going to the evidence? But that's exactly what Muslims do. This is a quotation from Mazhar Qazi. It says, Muslims and non-Muslims, notice, not just Muslims, Muslims and non-Muslims both agree that no change has ever occurred in the text of the Quran. It is a miracle of the Quran that no change has occurred in a single word, a single letter of the alphabet, a single punctuation mark, or a single diacritical mark in the text of the Quran during the last 14 centuries. After watching Jay's presentations, anyone in here agree with that? Huh? You agree with it? Okay. Jay's been convinced by the majestic words of Dr. Qazi, huh? Yeah. now think about that, because this is what you read. This is what you read when you open up an Islamic apologetics book. This is what you read. And if you are not going to actual people who are going to tell you what the actual evidence is, and you're just reading Muslim apologists who say this, that sounds pretty impressive. Wow, look, it says Muslims and non-Muslims agree. Everyone agrees. No change to anything in the Quran for 14 centuries. That is an amazing consensus. Totally false, but amazing nonetheless. So let's just, Jay's actually covered a bunch of the sort of early history of the Quran. Give a little recap, add a couple things here. But just so everyone has, because I know some people this is new. So this is the Quran, the history of the Quran in a nutshell, and not down through history, but just up through the period of the four rightly guided caliphs. But Muhammad received, according to Muslim sources, Muhammad received his first revelation around 610. And during this time, as Jay mentioned, this would be written down on things like palm leaves or flat stones or pieces of bone. And people would apparently write these down as aids to memory, because they were trying to memorize parts of the Quran. So if you wanted to memorize the Quran, you might not be able to memorize it right when Muhammad says it. So you write it on a shoulder blade or something like that, and you take it back to your tent and work on memorizing it there. But during this time, when Muhammad is receiving these revelations, so roughly from 610, Muhammad died in 632, so there can't be any new Quranic revelation after that. So during that period, there's no complete text of the Quran, but people have parts of it written down. And so Muhammad receives these revelations. Muhammad dies in 632, and then Abu Bakr, Muhammad's closest companion, the first of the rightly guided caliphs, comes up with the single most brilliant military strategy ever in the history of the world, if Islam is true. If Islam is true, and if Surah 15, verse 9, means what Muslims interpret it to mean, that Allah is going to protect the Quran, then Abu Bakr came up with the most brilliant military strategy ever, because he took all the people who had the Quran memorized and sent them out into battle. Now notice, if Allah is going to protect the Quran, you've got an invincible army, because Allah has to protect them. He has to, right? Allah has to protect that army, or parts of the Quran are going to be lost forever. So the Muslims got slaughtered. They eventually won the battle, but so many people died that parts of the Quran were lost forever. This is not according to me. This is according to Ibn Abi Dawud. This is the son of the famous hadith collector Abu Dawud. Many of the passages of the Quran that were sent down were known by those who died on the day of Yamama. Now, I notice Jay mispronounces this in exactly the way I do. I wonder if it's for the same reason. It's actually Yamama, but people laugh when you say Yamama, so you can't say the day of Yamama, so you say Yamama. So anyway, you can't say that. The day of Yamama, that's when you lost that Quran, the day of Yamama, right? Anyway. Many of the passages of the Quran that were sent down were known by those who died on the day of Yamama, but they were not known by those who survived them. Notice, many passages were known by people who died in this battle, but they were not known by those who survived them, nor were they written down, nor had Abu Bakr, Umar, or Uthman by that time collected the Quran, nor were they found with even one person after them. Now, we just started. Does this sound like perfect preservation right down to the letter for 14 centuries? Is that what it sounds like? Here's what's amazing. After this, after many passages of the Quran were lost in battle, because the people who had them memorized died in battle, after that, those passages weren't known by even one person after them. After that, that's when Abu Bakr said, we need a physical copy of what's left of the Quran, so that if this happens again and we lose in a big bloody battle, we don't lose any more of it. So the entire purpose of compiling the Quran as a book was because so much of it had been lost and they didn't want to lose any more. And yet, perfect preservation right down to the letter, when the entire purpose of putting it into a book form was to avoid losing any more of it. So, Abu Bakr had a physical Quran compiled. When Abu Bakr died, it was passed to Umar. Notice, this is not meant to be distributed. This is not meant to be passed around. This is just, we need at least one full copy of the Quran. So it passed on to Umar, the second of the rightly guided caliphs. Umar died. This was passed on to one of Muhammad's widows, Hafsa. And by the time of the third rightly guided caliph, Uthman, that's when you have people, Islam was spreading so far, so fast that more and more people wanted physical copies of the Quran. So they're writing them down from they're making copies from the rocks and the bones and so on, from having people recite it who know it, and then they can write it down and so on. And they ended up with so many differences in their copies of the Quran that well, you already heard what Uthman had to do. But Sahih al-Bukhari, notice, is the most trusted hadith collection in Islam. Uthman sent to every Muslim province one copy of what they had copied and ordered that all the other Quranic materials, whether written in fragmentary manuscripts or whole copies, be burnt. Now, you don't do that if all these things are in perfect harmony. Something else. And some people were really upset about this, that Uthman's burning all their Qurans. One of them, very important person, Sahih al-Bukhari 3808, Muhammad said, learn the recitation of the Quran from four people. You want to learn the Quran from anyone, learn it from these four guys, these are the best. Abdullah ibn Masud, he started with him, and notice we're told he started with him. In other words, this guy's at the top of Muhammad's list. He started with him. Salim, the freed slave of Abu Hudhaifa, Muad ibn Jabal, and Ubay ibn Ka'b. So names these four people. Now, interestingly, we know we have other hadiths on two of the people on this list and what they thought about the current state of the Quran. Ibn Sa'd, this quotation from Ibn Sa'd. Ibn Masud said, so Ibn Masud, that's Muhammad's top guy. If you want to learn the Quran from anyone, learn it from him. What does Ibn Masud say? The people have been guilty of deceit in the reading of the Quran. I like it better to read according to the recitation of him, i.e. Muhammad, whom I love more than that of Zayd ibn Thabit. Zayd ibn Thabit was the man who compiled the Quran under the reign of Uthman. He said, now notice what he said, I like to read it according to Muhammad's recitation more than Zayd's. But wouldn't they be exactly the same? That's what you'd expect if you listen to Dr. Badawi. By him besides whom there is no God. I learned more than 70 surahs from the lips of the apostle of Allah, may Allah bless him, while Zayd ibn Thabit was a youth having 2 locks playing with the youth. This kid's running around playing with G.I. Joes. I've got 70 surahs memorized and they're going to him instead of me. Notice, people have been guilty of deceit in the reading of the Quran. This is the main guy that Muhammad said, if you want to learn it from anyone, go to that guy. And that guy says, the Quran you got now is a deceit. It's deception. Why? Because it's according to Zayd, not according to how I heard it from Muhammad. Does this sound like perfect preservation? Now, here's a quick question. Do you think Dr. Jamal Badawi has read this? Do you think he's read these sources? I think he has. I think he's read all of these sources and more. So why would he be saying, anyway, let's think about it. Ibn Masud again, this is in Jami at-Tirmidhi. It's one of their top hadith collections. Ibn Masud said, "O you Muslim people," this is advice from Muhammad's top reciter of the Quran. "O you Muslim people, avoid copying the mushaf and recitation of this man," Zayd ibn Thabit. Don't do it. Don't copy it. Don't use his Quran. It's a deception. Don't do it. What does every Muslim in the world today use? Zayd ibn Thabit's Quran. Okay, so I guess Muhammad didn't know who to learn the Quran from. Muhammad was wrong. Now, if you can't trust Muhammad on who to learn the Quran from, what can you trust him on? By Allah, when I accepted Islam, he was but in the loins of a disbelieving man, meaning Zayd ibn Thabit. And it was regarding this that Abdullah ibn Masud said, "O people of Al-Iraq, keep the musahif that are with you and conceal them. Keep your copies of the Quran. Don't give them to Uthman, who's burning them. Don't do it. Don't take their Quran. Use this one." Does this sound like perfect preservation? Not at all. To anyone who's read this, and the Muslim apologists who tell you perfect preservation have read this. That's scary. But it's not just Ibn Masud. Notice here, this is Sahih al-Bukhari. This is their top source. This is their top source on the teachings of Muhammad and the companions and so on. Umar said, so this is their top hadith collection, what Umar is saying about Ubay ibn Ka'b, who was on the list, on Muhammad's list of four people to learn the Quran from. Umar said, Ubay was the best of us in the recitation of the Quran, yet we leave off some of what he recites. Now, wait a minute. So Ubay ibn Ka'b is quoting the Quran, and the rest of the community leaves off some of what he's saying? So that would mean they're different, right? That would mean if people are quoting two different Qurans here. How does Ubay respond to this? I have taken it from the mouth of Allah's messenger and will not leave it for anything whatsoever. So if you guys are not quoting the Quran like me, you guys are the ones with the problem. I heard it from Muhammad. Ubay, by the way, had 2 extra surahs in his Quran. The Quran today has 114 surahs. Ubay had 116 in his. They didn't consider those, they were 2 of the 2 additional prayers at the end of the Quran. So someone's got a problem here. So once again, Muhammad just doesn't know who to point to when he's telling them about the text of the Quran. Now we'll go through a couple more passages on changes to the Quran. This is Sahih Muslim. This is one of their other top hadith collections. Abu Musa al-Ashari said, sent for the reciters of Basra. They came to him, and they were 300 in number. They recited the Quran, and he said, you are the best among the inhabitants of Basra, for you are the reciters among them. So continue to recite it. It's warning them to continue reciting the Quran over and over again. Why would that be? Bear in mind that your reciting for a long time may not harden your hearts, as were hardened the hearts of those before you. Now think about this. Abu Musa is a companion of Muhammad. He's talking to the 2nd generation of Muslims. And he says, make sure you keep reciting the Quran. Even if you get sick of it, keep doing it anyway. Don't let your hearts be hardened, as were those who came before you. There's only one generation that came before them. There's only those original Muslims who came before them, Muhammad's original companions. So according to Abu Musa, Muhammad's original companions got so sick of reciting the Quran that their hearts were hardened. That's not me. This is Abu Musa, a companion of Muhammad, in one of their 2 most trusted hadith collections. But it gets better. We used to recite a surah which resembled in length and severity to Surah Barat. That's chapter 9 of the Quran. It's chapter 9 of the Quran. That's one of the long chapters of the Quran. So it's about the same size as Surah 9 of the Quran. I have, however, forgotten it, with the exception of this, which I remember out of it. If there were 2 valleys full of riches for the son of Adam, he would long for a 3rd valley, and nothing would fill the stomach of the son of Adam but dust. Now, suppose a Muslim wants to say, yeah, Abu Musa says he forgot the chapter, but that's just Abu Musa. He's talking to 300 professional Quran reciters. Don't you think they'd be able to say, oh, I remember the chapter you're referring to, even though you personally forgot it? No, this is coming right after he's warning them. He's warning them to stop, not to harden their hearts, not to get sick of reciting the Quran. But we have a way of verifying this. He says there's a chapter. It's about the same size as Surah 9, and he doesn't remember the chapter, but he remembers one verse out of it. Which chapter of the Quran is that verse in? Anyone? Anyone? No one? No one knows what chapter of the Quran this is from? It's not surprising because it's not in the Quran. What? We have a vote that it's actually is in the Book of Mormon. You could show us that. You could show us that one later. That would be outstanding evidence that he's a prophet. So here you have. He's saying we lost an entire chapter that's more than 100 verses long. It's more than 100 verses long. We lost it. It's gone. We forgot it. Why? Because Allah abrogated it? No, because we got sick of reciting the Quran so much. And the people who had it memorized, they died in battle. The rest of us didn't have it. So don't let your hearts become hard. Keep reciting it so you don't lose more of it like we did. And we used to recite a surah which resembled one of the surahs of Musabihat, and I have forgotten it. That's one of the short chapters at the very end of the Quran. So there's a short one and a really long one. We lost them both. Perfect preservation right down to the letter, as long as you ignore these multiple chapters that were forgotten by hardening their hearts and getting sick of reciting the Quran all day. This is Aisha. Aisha said, she's referring to Surah 33 here, the surah used to be recited in the time of the Prophet with 200 verses. But when Uthman wrote out the codices, he was unable to procure more of it than there is in it today. So, according to Aisha, who has the title in Islam, the mother of the faithful, according to the mother of the faithful, Surah 33 used to contain 200 verses, more with 200 verses. Surah 33 has 73 verses in it. So according to Aisha, not according to me, not according to Jamal Badawi, not according to Jay Smith, according to Aisha, the mother of the faithful, more than 100 verses were lost from Surah 33 alone. So now you got 2 entire chapters missing and more than 100 verses from this one chapter because the people who had it memorized died in battle. Perfect preservation, though. Sunan ibn Majah, 1944, it was narrated, Aisha said, we know some of the verses that came up missing from Surah 33. The verse of stoning and of breastfeeding an adult 10 times was revealed, and the paper was with me under my pillow. When the messenger of Allah died, we were preoccupied with his death, and a tame sheep came in and ate it. Allah couldn't protect the Quran from a sheep. He couldn't protect it from a sheep. It's not according to me. This is according to Aisha. By the way, I have an entire video called The Sheep Gate Conspiracy here. I don't think this is a coincidence here. These verses that came up missing. One is the verse of stoning. Aisha was accused of adultery during the time of Muhammad. So she knew what it felt like realizing, hey, I might be stoned to death as soon as the decision is made on whether I committed adultery. Right? So she knows what it's like to be on the receiving end of the accusations of adultery and that she would be stoned to death. That's supposed to be in the Quran. You read the hadith, that verse is supposed to be in the Quran. Read the Quran from beginning to end. It's not in the Quran. What happened? Aisha's sheep ate it. The other is the verse of breastfeeding an adult 10 times. I know some of you are familiar with this. I'll give you the short version. So, it can be a problem in life. Sometimes women have to work beside men that they're not related to and not married to. And sometimes there's not really anyone else around, right? Maybe you have a household servant, and you're a businessman, you have to go out of town. And now your household servant is around your wife. How can you trust them to be alone by themselves? So this matter was brought to Muhammad. Muhammad, I have to go out of town on business. I have a household servant. This guy, he grew up here. He's young, but now he's old enough to have a beard. And I go out of town, and he's around my wife. I'm a little nervous. What do I do? Enter Allah. Allah's wisdom comes down in the Quran. It says, no problem. Have her breastfeed him 10 times. That'll cut down any sexual tension. And people complained, as they often did, and Allah changed his eternal revelations, as he often did, and abrogated it to 5. So it's just 5. 5 breastfeedings. Okay, you don't need to do 10. Just put your breast in his mouth 5 times. And then you won't have to worry about them doing anything while you're gone. And, needless to say, most women found this absolutely ridiculous. Aisha had the only copy. Muhammad died, and oopsie, my sheep ate it. Best story ever. So we've gone through missing chapters, missing large passages, missing verses, a little missing phrase. Surah 33, verse 6 of the Quran. The prophet is closer to the believers than their own selves, and his wives are their mothers. So you got the prophet, he's closer to the believers than their own selves, and his wives are their mothers. That's what you'll read in the Quran if you read it today. There are tons of things like this in the Quran, but I bring up this one because if you have a Yusuf Ali Quran, you can actually see this in the Yusuf Ali edition. This is a note from Yusuf Ali, right? Muslims generally don't admit to differences, especially meaningful differences in the text of the Quran. But Yusuf Ali apparently just likes this alternative reading from Ubay ibn Ka'b better than what's in the Quran right now. So he adds, and again, if you get a Yusuf Ali Quran, which if you don't have, you can get it Barnes & Noble or Amazon or anywhere. It's the most popular Quran in the West. Yusuf Ali comments, in some qiras, like that of Ubay ibn Ka'b, occur also the words, and he is a father of them, referring to Muhammad. So Muhammad is a father of them, and his wives are their mothers. So Muhammad's wives are the mothers of the faithful, and Muhammad is the father of the faithful. So there occur also these words, and he is a father of them, which imply his spiritual relationship and connection with the words, and his wives are their mothers. Yes, this implies Muhammad's spiritual connection, even though, well, they're not in the Quran today. So which ones are we supposed to use here, right? Which version are we supposed to use here? Do you really like that special connection with Muhammad? Because you don't have that anywhere else in the Quran. So if you really like that spiritual connection, you got to say, oh, I'm going with Ubay ibn Ka'b's edition of the Quran. Of course, if you go with him, you got to take those extra 2 chapters, and things get very interesting. But does any of this sound like perfect preservation? Not a bit. And I'll close out with a quotation here. This is from Ibn Umar, who was a companion of Muhammad. He was the son of the second rightly guided Caliph Umar. And he kept seeing Muslims run around saying they have the entire Quran memorized. I've memorized the entire Quran. Kept hearing Muslims say that. Watch how he responds. Let none of you say, I have learned the whole of the Quran. For how does he know what the whole of it is, when much of it has disappeared? Let him rather say, I have learned what remains thereof. This is what happens if you actually read the Muslim sources and what they say about the text of the Quran. You would never in a million years, ever, read the Muslim sources and walk away thinking perfect preservation right down to the letter. Because there's nothing that says that. The sources all say things like this. So the sources constantly affirm multiple changes to the Quran. That's what you get if you go to Muslim sources, not Christian sources, not Jewish sources. And then the alternative is to go to the manuscript tradition. And what do you find in the manuscript tradition? Tons of variants, right? You find tons of variants in the manuscript tradition. So there is no possible place you could go, as far as evidence is concerned, to learn that the Quran has been perfectly preserved. There is no place to learn that because all of the evidence says the opposite. And yet, Muslim scholars who are aware of everything I've just said to you, will go out and tell their followers in their lectures, perfect preservation right down to the letter, and everyone agrees on this. It's not quite Takia. It's a slightly different version, but it's in the same ballpark there. But think about this. The entire idea is to give Muslims a false sense of security. And this has paid off for a long time, because for many, many decades here in the West, Muslim preachers have had an atmosphere of ignorance to deal with, and they could say anything they want. They could say anything they want to Christians, anything they want to atheists, anything they want to their own Muslim followers. They could say anything they want about the evidence for Islam, and no one is there to say, I don't think that's right. But again, even though this is disheartening that this kind of deception can spread so rapidly, it should be encouraging that no, there's nothing here. There's nothing here that anyone in here can't learn. And if enough people learn these basic things and enough people share these things with their Muslim friends, I'm like Jay. I believe we can see Islam crumble in a generation. And I believe if Christians do what we're called to do, I think we will see more Muslims come to Christ in our lifetimes than all previous generations before us have seen combined.